SEP Fanfic Readings presents Osculum Annuum by My Delphi. Chapter 9, 7th Year, Part 3. Following Snape fleeing Hogwarts, an eerie mood settled over the castle. Voldemort's voice seemed to echo from the walls, and Hermione shuddered. Although hissing and scratchy, it had the same luring lull as the locket, and she knew that it undoubtedly tempted more than one student or order member. That did not excuse McGonagall's decision to ban the Slytherin students to the dungeons, where they were locked up, leaving them defenseless and trapped for having been sorted into the wrong house. It made her heart feel like it was wrapped in iron as a cold, seething rage spread through her body. Hermione had been confronted with prejudice for as long as she could remember, being the strange, different girl before she had gone to Hogwarts, and then being the strange, Muggle-born witch who knew so much about magic despite growing up in the Muggle world. Voldemort had weaponized prejudice to intimidate, control, and cause death and destruction. And now her side was following that same path. It didn't sit right with her, and tainted the way she viewed her head of house. After all, if one acted just like those they perceived as the enemy, didn't that make them just as guilty and bad? Wouldn't it lead to a spiral of death and destruction? A fractured society that would never truly heal? She didn't want a world where Muggle-borns were no longer seen as peculiar, if it came at the cost of another group being marginalized. But she didn't really have the time to philosophize about the ethics and morals of warfare while preparing for an attack. One that might very well determine the future of the British wizarding world, and potentially cause many witches and wizards to flee to the continent, hoping Voldemort wouldn't try to take over all of Europe as well. They decided to separate. Harry would search for the diadem, while Hermione and Ron went to the Chamber of Secrets because, in a moment of pure genius, Ron had remembered that Harry had destroyed one of Voldemort's Horcruxes with basilisk venom by using a tooth, and since nobody else had since been informed about the entrance to said chamber, never mind been able to speak Parseltongue to unlock it, the giant beast had been left to rot, and there were undoubtedly skeletal remains for them to use. "Which one do you want?" Harry asked quietly, holding both Bellatrix's and Draco's wands. Hermione still didn't know whether she had accidentally taken the wand from Draco, or he had given it to her. But ever since their escape, it had been much more willing to follow her commands than Harry's. Unicorn hair wands are the least likely to change loyalties, and yet it responded almost as willingly as her Vinewood wand had. There was a compatibility that she didn't want to think about until the war was over. Perhaps not even then, knowing it might very well break her heart further, should she find out that he hadn't survived. "This one." She reached for Draco's wand. It pulsed gently in response as her magic extended towards it. Harry nodded and pocketed the one he had won from Bellatrix. Hermione hoped that the unyielding thing wouldn't refuse to obey his commands at an inopportune moment. But out of the two wands they had available, it was the better choice for him. "Destroy the cup if you have the tooth. Bring it with you so we can destroy the diadem. Use the map to find me." And so they split up. Hermione stared after her best friend, desperately hoping it wouldn't be the last time she saw him, before she followed Ron towards the second-floor girls' lavatory. She felt a mixture of apprehension and excitement as she entered Hogwarts' presumably biggest secret, and felt her breath stutter as she laid eyes on the massive skeleton. To think that Harry had fought the basilisk in his second year, and won. There was a certain irony to using part of the thing Voldemort had used to create his first Horcrux to now destroy him. It didn't make it any easier. Clasping one of the sharp, deadly teeth, she stared down at the Horcrux. A piece of Voldemort's soul. She was aware of Ron's expectant gaze, and yet she hesitated. If she did this, would she taint her soul? Wasn't it murder in a sense? The cup contained a piece of soul, no matter how tainted. To not just destroy a body, but destroy the very essence of a person, even a person like Voldemort, went against what Hermione stood for. "He has killed hundreds and done so proudly," she tried to convince herself. "If you don't do it, he might be successful in killing Harry." She knew. That didn't make it easier. It only caused the guilt simmering in her stomach to grow. He might have killed Draco. The thought had barely brushed her mind, then her arm was already moving and the tooth was rammed into the cup. It shrieked, and then there was a black smoke as the venom destroyed another part of Voldemort. Shaking, Hermione watched as the smoke disappeared. Then suddenly there was water, and she was back on her feet, Ron next to her. Waves crashed over them, and she would have fallen had it not been for his arm to steady her. She coughed, and when she had wiped the water out of her eyes, it was just in time to see Ron tilting his head towards her. Her eyes widened at the realization of what he wanted to do, and she quickly turned her head away. His lips met her cheek, and there was a look of surprise when he pulled back. "Hermione," he began, but Hermione quickly shook her head. "I'm sorry, Ron, but I don't—" She cleared her throat awkwardly. "I just see you as a friend. One of my closest friends, but nothing more." For a moment, he looked crestfallen and lost, like it had never occurred to him that she might not return his feelings. And that ignited a spark of anger. Did he truly think she would wait years for him while he pawned at Lavender Brown in every corner of the castle? Did he truly think she would just forget that he had abandoned her and Harry? "I think I've known for a while now," Ron said slowly, with a slight frown, and Hermione's anger disappeared. "But I didn't want to believe it. Felt like this was meant. It was the same way Harry and Ginny were meant for each other." "I'm sorry," Hermione repeated weakly, but he merely smiled. It didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's not your fault." He raised a hand and scratched the back of his neck. "Sorry for making it awkward. Let's just find Harry before I make more of an ass of myself." Only they didn't immediately find Harry. Leafing through the map, they searched one floor after another for his name, but there was nothing. Some corridors were filled with enough students that it was impossible to read individuals' names. Others were simply empty. A flash of a name made Hermione's heart seize up, because for a moment she had imagined that she had read Draco Malfoy. But Ron had already turned the map over. "Wait, let me see," Hermione croaked, reaching for the map. Hope was blooming in her chest. Maybe he had survived. Maybe he was here. Her hands were shaking as she took the parchment. But before she could check if it had truly been him, Ron exclaimed, "Harry!" He pointed at an empty spot on the map. The room of requirement, a brilliant place to hide a Horcrux. And because Hermione couldn't think of a good lie on the spot, she watched Ron pocket the map and followed him instead. Her mind was still racing, thoughts swarming like angry pixies, and her heart thudded in her chest. "He's alive, he's alive, he's alive," it seemed to say. While her mind whispered that she didn't know. Maybe she had misread another student's name. She couldn't allow herself to get too attached to the idea of him being alive, not when the odds were stacked against them, not when they were forced to stand on different sides in this war. "Come on, he needs the tooth." Ron had wrapped his hand around her wrist and was tugging her up the stairs toward the 7th floor. They watched as the door appeared on a blank stone, opening with a small squeak. As they entered, there were voices, muffled and hard to pinpoint. Hurrying through the rows of clutter, they became louder and louder until Hermione could make out the words. "Why didn't you tell her?" That was Harry. "Bellatrix," he continued, "you knew it was me. You didn't say anything." "Don't be a prat. Do him." Was that Goyle? And if it was, then— "Be quiet, Goyle." That voice. The relief that flooded her was strong enough to make her knees buckle. He was alive. He was alive. "I wondered why you didn't. You never really liked me, and you're loyal to your family. Had you told Bellatrix, Voldemort would have won, and your family would have been redeemed in his eyes, rewarded even. Instead, you lied," Harry said calmly. "But you didn't do it for me. You did it for her, didn't you?" Silence. "You warned her that night that Dumbledore died. When Death Eaters entered Hogwarts, you were the one who gave her the bracelet. You lied to keep her safe, and you gave her your wand when we escaped the manor. That is why it obeys her." "What is he talking about, Draco?" Crabbe said. "I said to be quiet," Draco hissed, just as Hermione and Ron rounded the corner. Harry and Draco were standing opposite one another, one holding the diadem, the other flanked by his cronies and clasping a wand. The air was thick with tension, and both Crabbe and Goyle looked eager to use their wands. Hermione barely noticed it. She only had eyes for Draco. Still dressed in a black suit, hair slightly disheveled and far too pale for his own good. But he was alive, and there were no obvious injuries. "The Cruciatus doesn't leave visible traces. That's what makes it such a popular Unforgivable." She squashed that thought violently. Not now. Not when he was standing right there, still alive and breathing and not dead. And not when he was looking at her with so much relief in his pale eyes. They flickered over her face, her drenched hair and clothes, to the wand in her right hand, and then they lingered on Ron's hand still clasped on her left wrist. He looked stricken. Quickly, Hermione tugged her hand back, ignoring Ron glancing down at her with furrowed brows. "Look at that! The mudblood is here as well." Goyle sneered behind Draco, pointing his wand at her. His eyes were dark and glittering with cruel hatred. "I've been waiting for this chance for a while now." He raised his wand, and the first syllable of the killing curse left his mouth. "Don't!" Draco shouted, pushing Goyle's arm to the side. The spell missed, disappearing into the vast difference of the room of requirement. Goyle looked perplexed, but before he could raise his wand again, Harry cast a Stupefy, and then a quick Expelliarmus, disarming Goyle. The wand clattered to the ground, where Ron snatched it up before either Crabbe or Draco could reach for it or fire their own spell. Not that Draco seemed interested in doing so, having lowered his wand the moment he had spotted Hermione. Crabbe, on the other hand, didn't hesitate. An expression of pure panic marred his round face, and his voice wavered as he cast Pestis Incendium. Fiendfyre. Dark magic. Uncontrollable and lethal. A wall of fire shot towards the dome-like ceiling, separating them from the three Slytherins. Through the flickering flames, Hermione could see how Goyle had grabbed Draco's arm and tugged him away from the fire, who struggled against his friend's grip while staring at her. Meanwhile, Crabbe seemed overwhelmed by the force of magic he had unleashed. He dropped his wand, and the Fiendfyre began to rage. "We need to go," Harry shouted over the roaring flames, and although Hermione wanted to run in the opposite direction, find her way around the wall of flames to make sure Draco was fine, she followed him. As she glanced over her shoulder, she saw how the flames took shape and began their hunt. She could feel the heat and hear the whisper of dark magic as the flames closed in on them. Turning to the right, they were confronted with another wall of flames. The fire spread faster than they could run. Another turn, and more fire, and more, until it advanced from all sides. It was pure luck that they found the brooms. Hermione wasn't fond of flying, and she would never be able to apply for a Quidditch team, but she knew how to control a broom. And after riding on a dragon, she was relieved to have at least some control as she soared through the air. "Where's the exit?" Ron shouted as they flew just out of reach of the licking, hissing flames, and Hermione craned her head. But instead of the door, she spotted three figures. Draco, Crabbe, and Goyle hadn't made it to the exit either. Instead, they were attempting to climb a small tower of precarious stacked furniture. It wobbled and swayed, and then part of it collapsed, and Crabbe fell into the sea of flames. Hermione saw how Draco hesitated, staring at the spot where his friend had been just moments before, and then he continued his own ascent. He joined Goyle on a small table at the very top of the tower. It would only be a matter of time before the fire reached them. "We need to save him!" she shouted over the roaring fire, hoping desperately that Harry had heard her. To her relief, her best friend merely nodded and adjusted his broom, steering towards the two figures. "You're kidding, right?" Ron gawked next to her, but followed Harry without another word of protest. But before they could reach them, the table tipped to the side, and both Slytherins fell. She would have screamed, had she been able to breathe. No, not after everything. He couldn't have died now, not now. She barely dared to look, but there he was, holding on to the edge of the table for dear life. Panic was etched into his handsome face, and even from afar Hermione could see that his knuckles were white from his tight grip and her heart seized with fear. But before he could fall, Harry was already there. Flying past him, he grabbed Draco's hand and pulled him onto his broom, followed by Ron, who saved Goyle. Hermione followed, overtaking them to a clear path through the flames, and then they reached the door. She fell off her broom, landing on the floor uncomfortably, followed by Ron, who was pushed aside by a fleeing Goyle. Behind her, she heard two thuds and saw how Draco and Harry had fallen off as well. But Harry was already up again, holding both the diadem as well as the basilisk tooth. Another part of Voldemort's soul died with a loud screech, and black smoke kicked into the still raging Fiendfyre, before the heavy doors of the room of requirement fell shut. Panting, Harry slunk to the ground, but Hermione barely had eyes for him. Her attention was entirely fixed upon Draco's prone body, where it was crumbled against the stone wall. He looked even worse than he had in the hospital wing all those months ago. Or was it a year now? Helplessly, her hands fluttered over his chest as she tried to assess his injuries. There was a cut on his forehead that bled profusely, drenching his hair and forming a slow, spreading puddle on the ground. "Headed G's often look worse than they are," she reasoned. But they didn't stop her hands from shaking as she picked up her wand and cast a quick healing spell, followed by a cleaning spell to remove the blood. The cut closed before her eyes, leaving nothing more than a hint of silver line that was almost impossible to see in the flickering light of torches. Almost as soon as her magic had washed over him, Malfoy began to move. He coughed weakly and turned on his back with a pained groan. One of his hands shot to his leg as if to steady it, but paused the moment his eyes flickered open. They roamed over her as a small smile tugged on the corner of his mouth. "This feels familiar." His voice was slightly dazed. "Perhaps a concussion? But I preferred what you were wearing last time. Still dream about it." Oh, he was definitely concussed. It didn't stop her from letting out a small sob of relief. Concussed or not, he was alive, and he looked at her like a blind man seeing the sun for the first time. "Well," her voice was shaky, "I still don't have a husband yet, so I figured I should dress modestly." "Yet." Malfoy repeated it as if tasting the word in his mouth. "Guess I'll have to do something about that." And that made her laugh. "Let's survive this first, and then we'll see." Hermione decided and brushed a strand of hair out of his face, just because she wanted to, and because she could. Draco blinked at her with wide eyes. He seemed positively dazed. "You still, even after what I did?" He sounded so astonished that she couldn't help herself. She lowered her head and kissed him, uncaring of their audience. Just a small, gentle brush of her lips against his. Someone to the left of her inhaled sharply. Probably Ron. When she pulled back, Draco was staring at her with intense determination. "If we survive this, I will cut your socks off," he promised, words slightly slurring. Merlin, he really had hit his head hard. "I'm sure you will," Hermione agreed as she ran her hand through his hair, searching for a bump. And she found one. It was already the size of a goose egg, and Draco winced when her fingers brushed over the sensitive skin. But he didn't try to move away. "But first, we need to take care of that concussion." It was slightly difficult to prop up a largely unresponsive body, especially since Draco seemed to be perfectly content to just watch her try to push him upright. Harry had mercy on her, silently kneeling next to her and using his strength to help sit him up. Propped against the wall, Draco already looked much better, although he had winced slightly when they had jostled his leg. "Just you wait, Granger," Draco muttered through drooping eyes. "You accepted the bracelet. Not letting you go now." He mumbled while reaching for her left hand and clasping it in his. His grip was weak enough that even a Kneasel kitten would have been stronger, but she didn't pull away. "You didn't tell me what it meant," she said dryly as she took his wand with her free hand and mentally went through the healing spell she knew. Then she gently waved the wand and felt her magic do the work. "Psh! Still accepted it," he harrumphed through a pained wince before his face suddenly smoothed out as the healing spell shrunk the bump on his head and lessened the concussion. But even magic could only do so much, and Hermione knew that he would have to remain still for at least an hour. It was time they simply didn't have. "Merlin." Draco's voice was clearer now as he rubbed a hand over his face. "I feel like a troll hit me upside the head." "Not a troll. Merely Harry's flying skills," Hermione pointed out and ignored Harry's quiet huff next to her. She didn't dare look at him, too afraid of what she would see. "The spell takes at least half an hour, and until you're healed you shouldn't move," she began, but Draco interrupted her. "I know. You should go." "But—" "No." His blue eyes were determined. "You need to help Potter stop him. I can take care of myself. Just leave me here and I'll stay out of trouble." Hermione pursed her lips unhappily. She would not leave him weak and defenseless like that. "At least take your wand back." He shook his head before she had even finished her sentence, wincing again. "No, you need it more than me. You can always return it later. Cast a few disillusionment and notice me not charms, and I'll be fine." Although it felt wrong to leave him, Hermione was pragmatic enough to know it was necessary. And with the strongest disillusionment charms she knew, he would be well hidden in the small alcove. Pressing one last kiss to his lips, Hermione got to work. She used the strongest disillusionment spell she knew, and added multiple layers of wards on top of them. "Potter," he muttered, and Harry, who was still awkwardly crouching next to her, cleared his throat. "What is it, Malfoy?" His voice was a strange mixture of apprehension, confusion, and uncomfortableness. "If anything happens to her, I'll hold you personally accountable," the Slytherin ordered curtly, and made her best friend laugh quietly. "Don't worry, Malfoy. I'll keep her safe," Harry promised nonetheless before he gave Hermione a meaningful look. They needed to go and stop Voldemort. "I'll be back as soon as I can. I promise," Hermione told Draco quietly, who still hadn't let go of her hand. "Which I told you not to worry about me. I'll be fine," he grumbled, leaning his head against the stone wall behind him. His thumb was playing with the bracelet on her wrist. "And I told you that you don't get to dictate whom I decide to worry about or not," she retorted before she gently pulled her hand away. It felt as if something had pierced her right through the heart. "I'll come back, and then I'll lecture you about needing to be more careful next time." "Whatever you say, love." Draco's smile was slightly crooked. "I'll see you later." He sounded so sure, like he already knew that everything would work out just fine. Hermione hoped his optimism wasn't blatant delusion caused by his concussion. Still, she had to be optimistic as well. Otherwise, she wouldn't be able to leave him behind. "Later," she echoed and got to her feet. Taking a deep breath, she turned to Harry and nodded. They needed to go. Now. They had a battle to win, a Horcrux to destroy, and a maniac to somehow get rid of. It didn't stop her from looking back at Draco as they hurried down the long corridor. He was looking after her, and his resigned expression told her all she needed to know about their chances. He didn't believe his own words, so how could she? Tears burned in her eyes, and they would have undoubtedly spilled over had it not been for Harry. "So," her best friend said dryly, "Malfoy, huh?" A shaky laugh escaped her. "I don't know how that happened either." "I can see it, I think. In a really strange way. Still a surprise." He sounded thoughtful. "Who did you think it was?" "Please don't say Crabbe or Goyle." Hermione wondered, and now there was a hint of pink on Harry's cheeks. "I thought it might have been Cormac. And you didn't tell me because his family is involved in the ministry and might be punished for your involvement." He ducked his head when she made an outrageous squeak and hit his shoulder. "Once this thing is over, I will hex you so you can't walk straight for a week," she promised darkly, but began to smile when Harry laughed, all the while ignoring Ron's heavy gaze that made her neck prickle. They needed to get to the Shrieking Shack, because it was where Voldemort was, along with that blasted snake. However, it was easier said than done, and navigating a school that Hermione could find her way through in her sleep was difficult in the midst of a battle. Spells were fired left and right, bodies lay on the ground, and students were trying to flee, overwhelmed by the brutality of the battle. They turned a corner, and there was a burly body crouched over a student. Hermione felt sick when she saw the ribbons in Lavender Brown's wide eyes. They had never been friends, but they had known each other for years. "No!" Ron pushed past her, brandishing Goyle's wand. The burly Death Eater looked up, gaze wild and teeth stained with blood. Hermione only belatedly realized that it was Fenrir Greyback, the werewolf who was fond of targeting children and biting them as brutally as possible. He seemed mildly surprised by their appearance, but not especially impressed. "It's not much fun when they stop struggling anyway," he jeered, and looked ready to turn around and flee like the coward he was. But Hermione was much faster. The bodybind spell hit him before he had even gotten to his feet, and the stunning spell that followed knocked him out cold. He crumpled to the ground with a muffled groan. Ron was already next to Lavender. The girl was still moving and making quiet noises as her lips trembled in an attempt to speak. The wound on her neck was nasty, and had they interfered only moments later, it would have undoubtedly been deep enough for her to bleed out. Her chances weren't good, but they weren't bad either. "We can't leave her like this," Ron said decisively, and Hermione agreed. "You need to take her to the infirmary. I'll keep an eye on Harry." She glanced at Harry, who nodded. "I'll join you as soon as she's being taken care of," Ron promised. He didn't take his eyes off Lavender's pale face. Maybe, just maybe. So they continued without the third part of their trio. Out of the castle, down the dark hills and towards the lonely, dark house that still gave her goosebumps. The planks creaked underneath their weight as they entered the house, and Hermione was quick to cast a Muffliato. They had only made it halfway down the hallway, towards the stairs, when they heard muffled voices from one of the rooms on the ground floor. They snuck closer and slipped into the room next to it, so they could peer through the dilapidated wall. The first thing Hermione saw were candles. They illuminated the dark room enough for her to see more than just shadows and vague silhouettes. An old, tattered armchair, a broken table, grimy wooden planks, and equally grimy walls. Torn curtains moved in the harsh breeze that came through the broken windows, and there was the snake. Nagini had curled up on a faded rug in front of the cold, empty fireplace. Her body was constantly moving, and her tail twitched as her beady eyes observed her master. She was constrained in a cage. The metal bars were glinting and seemed almost translucent at times. Magic. Voldemort stood with his back to them. His dark, silken cloak reminded her of water as he moved his arms. The pattern underneath his sickly skin seemed to move, and she didn't know if it was due to the flickering candles or another effect of the dark magic that had torn and twisted what remained of his mind and soul. In his hands dangled the Elder Wand. And across from him was their former professor. Severus Snape watched Voldemort with a calm and blank face. He stood tall as he waited for the other wizard to speak. "I have a problem, Severus." Hermione's voice was a snake-like hiss. He thoughtfully tapped the Elder Wand against his hand. "The wand. It refuses to obey me. It resists my commands." "My lord, you have performed extraordinary magic with this wand." If Snape was nervous, he didn't show it. "There is no wand more powerful than this." "And yet," the Dark Wizard interrupted calmly, "this wand is no more wondrous and powerful than the one I claimed at Ollivander's all those years ago. I am an extraordinary wizard, Severus. The acts I could perform with this wand. However, something is amiss." No answer. Goosebumps spread across her arms at the danger in his words. She wondered if Snape felt the barely controlled anger underneath Voldemort's skin as much as she did. Slowly, he began to pace. As he moved, his silken robes followed him like smoke. "I considered why this might be, and finally I understood." His pace halted. "Do you know why I called you away from the battle?" Hermione saw how Snape's dark eyes flickered to Nagini. The snake hissed lowly. "I do not, my lord. But I ask you to allow me to return to the battle. Allow me to find Potter for you." "You are far too much like Lucius. Potter will come to me. I have been inside his head. I know what he will do. How noble he is. Eager to sacrifice himself to protect others. So, Gryffindor." He couldn't have been more scathing if he had tried. "My lord, I merely want to serve you. Allow me to find the Potter boy before he gets killed by one of your followers. As you said, he is yours to kill," her professor said smoothly. "My instructions to my Death Eaters were clear, Severus, and they would not dare to disobey me. They are loyal. But are you?" It wasn't really a question. "My lord." "Do not think I have been unaware of your weakness for mudbloods. First Potter's mudblood mother, and now his mudblood friend. I brushed her mind, Severus. It made me question just how well you were playing the role of a former and repentant Death Eater. Were you playing Dumbledore for a fool, or were you trying to fool me? You saved her life, went out of your way to supply her with potions. You warned her to stay away from someone who would be dangerous for her. You played your role well, Severus." Hermione held her breath. I intended to wait until you were no longer useful to me. But the wand's refusal to obey me has forced me to act now. Voldemort sighed. The Elder Wand obeys the wizard who killed its last master. And you were the one to kill Dumbledore. As long as you are alive, it will never serve me. My lord, Snape began, but it was too late. Voldemort had pointed his wand at Nagini's cage. A spell shot out of his wand, and the cage vanished. A whispered hiss followed. Parseltongue. Harry inhaled sharply next to her, having understood Voldemort's command. Without hesitation, Nagini attacked. Snape didn't even have time to scream before the snake buried its fangs in his neck. He was thrown to the floor with a choked noise as Nagini wound herself around him. Hermione clasped her hands over her mouth to muffle her scream. Harry's hand was on her shoulder in an instant, squeezing her tightly, grounding her so she wouldn't lose herself to the horror unfolding before them. She should have looked away, but she couldn't. Just like Voldemort didn't look away. Instead, he calmly watched his snake for a moment, before he called her back. Apparently satisfied with the oozing wounds marring Snape's neck, he left. He simply left, taking Nagini with him. Assured that his servant wouldn't survive the wounds, and slowly bleed to death in an isolated hut. As soon as they were sure he was gone, Hermione and Harry left their hiding place. They hurried over to Snape, who was breathing wetly. Blood drenched his clothes and formed a small puddle underneath him, escaping the corner of his mouth. His dark eyes were wide and restless. They widened even more when he spotted them, and to Hermione's surprise, he beckoned them closer. In an instant, they were kneeling next to him. His lips formed words, but it took him 3 tries until he could make a sound. Take it, Snape breathed, and then there was a slip of silver escaping his eye. A tear. No, more. A memory. Take it. Hermione only needed a second to understand what he was asking for. She opened her beaded bag and acioed one of the empty vials into her hand. It had been one of the ones containing the potion Snape had brewed for her. The small slip of parchment with his scratchy handwriting was still attached to the glass. She handed it to Harry before he could even ask for one. Carefully, her best friend caught the single tear, and they watched as the silver expanded inside the glass vial. Pensive, their professor breathed in what sounded like a death rattle. There was so much blood. So much. Hermione thought she had grown used to the sight when she accidentally splinched Ron, but she... Of course! She opened her bag almost violently. She had prepared for the Horcrux hunt for months and packed every necessity that might have saved their lives, including a Bezoar. Let me through, Harry, Hermione ordered, and when he didn't comply immediately, she simply shouldered him aside. The puddle of blood had spread enough for it to drench her trousers, but she ignored it. Hermione, what? He asked, but she shook her head decisively. Not now. We don't have time. Go to the Pensieve and view the memories. I'll follow you as soon as... She had stopped the bleeding or Snape had bled out, but she couldn't say that. Instead, she settled on, as soon as I'm done. For a moment, Harry stared at her, and she could see the question in his eyes. Why would she care whether Snape lived or died? What else had she kept secret from him? Snape made a small noise in the back of his throat, and Harry looked away. Are you sure? He said quietly, but already got to his feet, still clutching the vial in his hands. I'm Hermione Granger. When am I not? She retorted, and that seemed to convince Harry. With one last glance at Snape, he left. Foolish girl, Snape coughed wetly, and Hermione managed a small, wobbly smile as she pulled Essence of Dittany, Bezoar, and an old pullover out of her bag. You already established that during my first week at Hogwarts, she responded, while she pressed the pullover against his neck in an attempt to stop the worst of the bleeding. The gray cotton immediately soaked up the blood, turning dark. If her professor could have, he would have surely looked indignant, or maybe even made a sharp remark. She also wouldn't put it past him to take 10 points from Gryffindor for her cheek, despite the battle and the fact that she hadn't returned for her 7th year. But the loss of blood kept him from helping Slytherin win the House Cup. Instead, he merely watched her as she unscrewed the vial of Dittany, and obligingly, if unwillingly, opened his mouth when she pressed the bezoar to his lips. "Why?" he rasped after he swallowed the vile medicine. "It's a long list. At least 10 inches. Do you want to hear all of it, or just the main reasons?" Hermione said lightly, because otherwise she knew everything would become too much and she would fold. Her professor's lips twitched. Maybe it had been a fleeting smile. If it had, then he had lost even more blood than she had thought. "You saved my life," Hermione explained, carefully pulling back the drenched cotton. As soon as she saw the wounds, she began to pour the essence of dittany. The clear fluid pooled in the deep holes Nagini had left. They ran over his pale skin, washing away some of the blood before pooling in the next bite. "You saved Draco's life. You warned me about him and what might happen if anybody found out. You knew about the attack on Hogwarts and prepared my potions in advance, enough to last me a year, and you gave me the recipe." More dittany, more and more, all she had, until the vial ran out. She itched to use the healing spells, but she knew that they would be ineffective against a bite laced with Nagini's poison. The bezoar and the dittany needed to work. It didn't add up. Why would you do all of that if you were loyal to him? I've been trying to figure out which side you've been on since you killed Dumbledore. It didn't make sense. Before her eyes, the wounds grew shallow and began to close. He was still bleeding, and without a few blood-replenishing potions he would die. But he had a chance. "Always overthinking." "I know. That was a frequent comment when you graded my essays." She fished for another abandoned piece of clothing that she could use to cover the wounds. Another old pullover, this one pink. Hermione rolled it up quickly. She tilted Snape's head forward so she could wrap it around his neck, using the sleeves to tie a knot just tight enough that it would put pressure on the still oozing wounds. "The bezoar has neutralized Nagini's poison. The dittany has stopped most of the bleeding. I will return to the castle and find help." Hermione balled her shaking hands into tight fists. "I promise." Snape didn't answer. Instead, he stared at her thoughtfully. Then he raised a hand and brushed a finger over her cheek. "You are like her. Wanted to save." His voice died off, and his arm fell to the floor. His eyes closed. Panicked, Hermione immediately grabbed his wrist and tried to feel for a pulse, and for a brief, horrifying moment there was nothing. But then she felt it, weak and slow, but there. He still had a chance. "I will get help," she promised. It was a promise she intended to keep. Hermione's sides and calves were burning as she raced up the hill towards Hogwarts. She was breathing heavily, and her blood was pumping. Her heart was beating loud enough that she only noticed the absence of screams and explosions when she reached the destroyed court. It was empty. There were still traces of the battle that had raged when they had headed to the Shrieking Shack, and there were bodies on the ground. But it was empty otherwise. Cautiously, she continued, clasping her wand tightly in her hand. The eerie calm sent shivers down her spine. But fear made her not pay as much attention as she should have. She only noticed she wasn't alone when a figure stepped out of a dark, half-destroyed archway. When she recognized him, panic clawed at her throat. Antonin Dolohov. He had barely changed since he had seen him last, with the same harsh face and the same dark expression in his eyes. He was holding his wand casually as he watched her, like a snake watched an unsuspecting mouse. There was a slight stabbing sensation in her chest, and her scar throbbed as she remembered the force of his curse and the agony of it. Nothing compared to Crucio, but nevertheless a slow, torturous death. "Don't stand there like an idiot, Granger. Fight!" A small voice ordered in the back of her head, sounding suspiciously like Draco. But she had continued to hold her wand loosely, not raising it to defend herself. She couldn't. It was as if she had once again caught a glimpse of the basilisk. "Oh, how long I have waited for this!" Dolohov's voice was disgustingly smooth and warm. It could almost be called affectionate. "I thought about what I'd do to you for a long time, little mudblood. Azkaban can be very dull." His wand hand twitched. Hermione ground her teeth to keep them from chattering. Her fingers clenched around her own wand. "I had so much planned for you, pretty mudblood. I am a very resourceful and creative man. I might have even let you live, but we're short on time, and I know that there are others who are just as eager to finish you off. This might be my only chance." A noise to her left. It had sounded like a step, or a stone skidding after having been accidentally kicked. It was a reflex to glance toward the origin of the noise, and she briefly took her eyes off of Dolohov. When her gaze snapped back to him, it was just in time to see him point his wand at her. This time, she wasn't fast enough to silence his spell. A bolt of purple lightning shot towards her, and Hermione braced herself for the inevitable pain and slow, agonizing death. Draco's face flashed before her, and then Harry's and Ron's as well as her parents', and she took comfort in the fact that at least they would never have to grieve their daughter. A fraction of a second before the curse could hit her, someone barreled into her side and threw her off her feet. She made a noise of startled surprise, exhaling harshly when her back collided with the hard ground. But it was nothing compared to the white-hot pain radiating from the back of her head, where it had smacked harshly against the stone. A startled cry of pain escaped her throat, and she tried to blink through the onslaught of black spots that were clouding her vision. Over the ringing in her ears, she heard a commanding voice shout an unfamiliar incantation, and then Dolohov was shouting in outrage before another thud indicated that his body had hit the ground. Finally, her vision cleared, and the first thing she saw was Dolohov's still body lying on the ground. He wasn't dead. His chest was still rising steadily, but he was definitely unconscious, and would be for a while. Dragging her gaze away from his form, her heart stopped when she finally met the eyes of her rescuer. Pale blue, almost light enough to be gray, a familiar color that had become a source of comfort at some point. Only the face was all wrong. A hint of lines around the eyes, a slight stubble on a sharp jawline, and most tellingly, a cascade of ragged silver hair framing it. It wasn't Draco who was kneeling over her, pinning her to the ground with his weight. Lucius Malfoy was staring down at her, clutching his wife's wand in one hand and using the other to brace himself over her. Had he saved her? He had. Hermione swallowed down a sudden burst of hysterical laughter. Lucius Malfoy, renowned Death Eater, Azkaban escapee, and loyal subject to one Dark Lord known for hating Muggleborns, had gone out of his way to save her life, and rendered another Death Eater incapable while doing so. "My son." Mr. Malfoy's voice was scratchy and brittle. "Where is he? Where's Draco? I can't find him." He broke off, and the anguish in his eyes broke Hermione's heart. "In the castle. 7th floor," she whispered. "Outside the room of requirement. He's injured, but only lightly. I placed some disillusionment charms to hide him." A rush of air escaped Draco's father, and his relief was almost palpable. Then the Malfoy patriarch pushed himself to his feet, and without another glance at her, he disapparated. Hermione felt an odd sense of detachment as she got to her feet. Her world felt as if it had tilted in its axis, and she needed a moment to adjust. It had taken her long enough to comprehend Narcissa Malfoy's interference at the manor, and how she had stopped her husband from informing Voldemort. How was she supposed to understand Lucius Malfoy saving her life? Dazed, she stumbled toward the castle, through the heavily damaged doors, and suddenly there was a flurry of bodies again. Those injured and those unharmed, some laying on the floor and others sitting to the side, crying, holding each other, or staring blankly at the walls. She wanted to find Harry, Ron, and all the rest to make sure they hadn't lost anyone. But she had to think rationally. Her first priority was finding Madame Pomfrey. It was relatively easy, but convincing her to go and help Snape, or at least find someone willing to bring him to the infirmary, was difficult. It took a lot of persuasion, and eventually outright begging, along with a fumbled recount of Snape supplying her with potions and saving her life. But eventually Madame Pomfrey listened, although Harry's support helped. He had suddenly appeared, looking pale and shaken, and had told Madame Pomfrey that they had all been wrong about Snape, and that he was fighting for their side and had been for well over a decade. They had done all they could for Severus Snape. Now they needed to take care of their friends, if they were still alive. They were, but they had lost so many. So many students, so many centaurs, so many elves. Amidst them so many names she knew. Colin Creevy's empty eyes, Remus, and Tonks laying side by side before a sheet was pulled over them. Fred Weasley, who had teased her and joked and whom she had only seen a few hours ago. How could he be dead? How could any of them? There were tears, so many tears, and she could feel herself cry as she hugged and was hugged by the Weasleys. But they didn't have time to grieve, not now, because Snape's memories had revealed that Harry himself was a Horcrux, and he was going to sacrifice himself. Voldemort had been right. Harry would come to him. Hermione wanted to join him in a heartbeat, but her best friend stopped her. "I promised Malfoy I would keep you safe," Harry said against her shoulder after she had pulled him into a tight and desperate hug. And so she watched him go, a lone figure walking out of Hogwarts and towards the forest, doing something many others couldn't, and she wasn't able to help him. She watched him until he had disappeared from her view, only looking away when Ron softly cleared his throat. I need to go back," he said quietly, and Hermione nodded numbly. "Yes." "But," he cleared his throat again, "I want you to know that the thing with Malfoy is okay." Her head whipped around. When their eyes met, she could see the sincerity burning into them. "I can't say that I understand why or when, but it looks like you really like him for some reason, and he really likes you. So I just want you to know that I don't hate you or anything like that." And then he left, to join his family in their grief, until the second attack would come, the second and final attack. Hermione went to the 7th floor instead, but the alcove where they had left Draco was empty. It seemed as if Lucius Malfoy had found his son and taken him with him. Where to, she didn't know. To Voldemort? To safety? If that still existed in their world. So she wandered around for a while, through the halls and corridors and empty classrooms, until the sky started to turn gray. Until the shadows of the night were chased away as a new day dawned. Had Harry seen one last sunrise? Had he died long before the first streaks of gray appeared on the horizon? Her question was answered when she glanced out one of the windows and saw a crowd dressed in black approach, led by Voldemort, and behind him, Hagrid, who was carrying someone. The entire castle rushed towards the courtyard. Hermione followed as well, joining the crowd spilling out of the castle. Voldemort and his followers were already waiting for them. His laugh was vile as he declared Harry's death, and the victorious cheers from his Death Eaters made her clench her hand around her wand angrily. Her eyes flickered over the crowd dressed in black, flickering over Bellatrix and the other Death Eaters she had encountered when they were at the Malfoys. Lucius and Narcissa, without Draco. Hermione looked around, panic clawing at her throat until she spotted Draco amongst the body of students. He was standing still, making no attempts to join the man who had branded his sign into his flesh. He didn't move when Voldemort made the insulting offer that they were allowed to switch sides, to join him in his twisted cause. But he paled when his father addressed him. Lucius Malfoy's voice was shaking as he called his son's name. Hermione could see Draco's expression shudder. His eyes flickered to hers, only to snap back to his parents when his mother spoke up. "Draco," she said softly, holding out her hand. "Come." When he didn't move, she added a soft, "Please." Only she wasn't looking at Draco anymore. She was staring at Hermione, asking her, begging her to... Slowly, Hermione looked back at Draco, who was still staring at her. For a moment, she wanted to shake her head, desperately so. Wanted to move through the body of students and take his hand to keep him with her. But she knew the consequences. If he didn't go back, Voldemort wouldn't hesitate to kill his parents, and make it an example of loyalty. Narcissa Malfoy had saved them at the manor. Lucius had saved her from Dolohov. She could save their son, and them from certain death. She nodded once, and watched as Draco swallowed tightly before he walked across the courtyard toward his parents. She watched as Voldemort embraced him, watched as Lucius pulled him closer protectively, and how Narcissa ran a hand through her son's hair. Her blue eyes flickered to Hermione again, and even from the distance she could see the gratefulness in them. and then Neville spoke up. And suddenly Harry moved, tumbling out of Hagrid's arms and falling to the ground, and Narcissa decisively took her son's hand and pulled him away from the castle. Lucius followed his wife and child, only glancing back once when Bellatrix called his name hysterically. Chaos broke loose. Later, Hermione would only remember flashes of what followed after Harry had fallen out of Hagrid's arms. The mandatory mind healer, whom she had seen 4 times before realizing that, while it might certainly be helpful for some, therapy didn't help her, had told her that her mind was trying to protect itself and suppressing traumatizing experiences, that those memories might come back one day, and if they did, she would need to be prepared for them. They never would, but Hermione didn't know that then. All she had was glimpses of shields being thrown up and Voldemort following Harry, of Nagini and her and Ron trying to kill that blasted snake, of Neville holding a sword. Things were patchy, like a torn film that was missing scene after scene, skipping over significant moments until, suddenly, it reached a part that wasn't torn and continued normally. She found herself sitting in the great hall, clutching a cup of tea in one hand and Draco's wand in the other. Next to her sat Harry, equally silent and also holding tea. She slowly turned her head to look at him, bruised and bloody and so alive. A ray of sunshine fell through one of the broken windows, reflecting off his once again broken glasses. It was a reflex to wave her wand. "Oculus reparo," she whispered, and Harry smiled crookedly. She didn't need to be a legilimens to know that he was thinking of the exact same moment she was. The first time they had met on board the Hogwarts Express. She had been searching for Neville's toad, and he had been trying to eat his weight in sweets. And promptly, Hermione burst into tears.